He wanted to sell his late father's farm and return to the city, but his son found something in an old shed that turned their lives upside down. What exactly had his grandfather been keeping all these years? See for yourself. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The city had a way of swallowing a man whole, leaving only fragments of the person he once dreamed of becoming. For years he had convinced himself that the noise, the endless traffic, and the constant pulse of strangers moving past one another were the signs of a life that mattered. He had come here as a young man, chasing ambition with a suitcase in hand, certain that success lay at the top of some office tower or in the pages of contracts signed late into the night. But now, years later, he found himself in a cramped apartment with peeling paint and windows that rattled in the wind, clinging not to dreams, but to survival. The job that had once promised a future barely covered the rent. His days passed in repetition, commuting on crowded buses, staring at computer screens, eating dinners too small to satisfy. The city was no longer a place of opportunity, but a cage whose bars he had chosen himself. Through it all, his 10-year-old son was the only light that kept the shadows from closing in. The boy was quiet but curious, the kind of child who found wonder in the smallest details. A moth clinging to a lamppost, the way rainwater carved rivers through the gutters, the stories hidden in the cracks of old sidewalks. Yet even in his imagination, the limits of their apartment showed. Space was tight, toys were few, and every corner of their home seemed to echo with the absence of something larger. The man often looked at his son and wondered what sort of life he was offering him. A boy deserved open skies and fresh air, not endless sirens and the smell of gasoline. But those thoughts were quickly buried beneath bills, deadlines, and the weight of a life that had turned into little more than endurance. The change began with a letter. It arrived in a plain envelope, the handwriting unfamiliar, the postmark from a small rural town he had not seen in years. Inside was not the expected stack of legal documents, nor the cold efficiency of a lawyer's signature, but a single page written in the hand of a man he had once called Father. The words were simple, unadorned, and yet they cut deeper than any speech could have. The letter informed him of his father's passing, but more than that, it left behind a choice. The farm is yours now. If you wish, sell it and move on. If you wish, live in it and make it your own. I leave the decision with you. There were no long explanations, no apologies for years of silence, no promises beyond those few lines. But in their simplicity was something that struck him harder than he expected. He sat with the letter for hours, reading it over and over, the paper crinkling beneath his fingers until the creases grew deep. His memories of his father were few and mostly shaped by distance. The old man had never left the farm, and after the son moved to the city, the visits grew rare, then stopped altogether. Letters had been exchanged at first, polite updates about weather and harvests, but even those had eventually ceased. Now, in the place of reconciliation, came this final message, a bequest, not just of land, but of choice. The simplicity of it gnawed at him. No instructions, no guilt, just the quiet acknowledgement that he could walk away or return. His son found him at the kitchen table late that evening, the letter still unfolded before him. The boy asked questions he could not fully answer, about grandfathers he had never met, about what it meant to inherit land. He answered what he could, but the truth was that he did not yet know himself. All he knew was that something stirred inside him, a mixture of regret and possibility, as though the letter had opened a door to a past he had long closed. That night, after his son was asleep, he looked around the small apartment, at the walls that had grown too familiar, the city lights that seeped through thin curtains, and he realized how much they had both been suffocating. The decision, though terrifying, seemed less a choice than an inevitability. Within days, he arranged time off work, packed their few belongings into boxes, and rented a small truck. The act of leaving the city was harder than he expected. The streets he had once found thrilling now seemed hostile, and as the truck crawled through traffic, he felt as though the city was reluctant to release him, clinging with horns and red lights and endless streams of strangers. But eventually the buildings thinned, the concrete gave way to fields, and the road carried them farther than he had driven in years. The journey to the farm was long, winding through stretches of countryside that seemed untouched by time. Rolling fields gave way to patches of woodland, small towns with faded signs, and roads that narrowed until only one vehicle could pass at a time. His son pressed his face against the window, pointing out cows grazing by fences, horses running along ridgelines, silos standing like sentinels against the horizon. The boy's excitement was contagious, and for the first time in years the man felt his chest lighten. The silence of the road, broken only by the hum of the engine, carried with it a sense of release. When at last they turned onto the gravel drive marked only by a weathered wooden post, the man felt a shiver of unease and familiarity. The farm stood at the edge of a wide valley, the field stretching in every direction like an ocean of grass. The house came into view slowly, its roof sagging in places, its paint long since peeled by sun and rain. Windows were shuttered with boards, and the porch leaned at an angle that suggested years of neglect. Nearby stood the outlines of barns and an old metal-sided structure that must have been the storage hangar. The fences were broken, the pasture overgrown, but the bones of the place were unmistakably strong. They parked by the house, and for a long moment neither moved. The boy was the first to step out, his shoes crunching on gravel, as he took in the space with wide eyes. He darted toward the yard, running through weeds taller than his shoulders, his laughter echoing in the stillness. The man followed more slowly, his steps heavy, his heart caught between sorrow and recognition. Every corner of the farm whispered of the father who had tended it, the man he had left behind. The air smelled of damp earth and hay, and though the place was worn and tired, it still held a dignity that no years could erase. Inside, the house greeted them with silence. Dust lay thick on the wooden floors, and cobwebs stretched across corners, but the structure was intact. The rooms were small but solid, the walls lined with wood that had aged into a warm, dark hue. A fireplace dominated the main room, its hearth cold but inviting. There were 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with an old pump sink, and furniture that seemed to wait patiently for occupants who never came. He moved from room to room, opening shutters, letting in shafts of light that illuminated the dust motes, dancing like tiny spirits. With each window unbarred, the house seemed to breathe again, slowly waking from its slumber. That night, after unpacking what little they had brought, they sat by lamplight at the old wooden table. Dinner was simple. Canned soup heated on the stove, but the silence of the valley outside gave it a weight that no city meal ever had. Through the open windows, they could see stars stretching in numbers they had never imagined, each one sharp and clear against the dark sky. His son marveled at the quiet, declaring it a different kind of silence than the one they knew in the city. It was not emptiness, but a fullness, as if the land itself was thinking. The man listened to his child's wonder and felt the stirrings of something long absent hope. Later, as he tucked the boy into the smaller bedroom, he lingered by the window. From there, the valley stretched out below them, dotted with a few distant lights. The boy fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the day, but the man sat awake long into the night, listening to the creak of the house, the rustle of the wind, the distant call of night birds. He thought of his father, of the years lost, of the letter that had brought him back. He thought of what it meant to choose to sell, to leave or to stay. For the first time in years, he felt that perhaps he was not simply enduring life, but standing at the beginning of something new. The days that followed were filled with work, small tasks that began to shape the house into a home again. Dust was swept, windows unshuttered, boards pried from frames. His son helped eagerly, turning chores into games, transforming the labor into moments of joy. Each repaired hinge, each mended crack, each room filled with light added weight to the decision he had not yet spoken aloud. Perhaps this was not simply a place left behind. Perhaps it was a place waiting for them. Yet even as the house brightened, the land beyond reminded him of the scale of the task. Fields choked with weeds, fences broken, machinery rusted. It would take more than weeks to restore, perhaps years. But each morning, when he stepped outside and breathed the crisp air of the valley, he felt a strength he had forgotten he possessed. His father's letter had left him free to choose, and though the road ahead was uncertain, the choice no longer seemed as impossible as it had once been. The first chapter of their new life was beginning, and though he could not yet see its end, he knew this much. The farm was more than land and timber. It was history, memory, and a chance to build a life, not measured in square footage or paychecks, but in roots and belonging. Standing on the porch one evening, watching his son chase fireflies across the darkening yard, he realized the farm was no longer just his father's. It was theirs. The first morning on the farm began with the cry of birds rather than the sirens of the city. Sunlight filtered through unshuttered windows, spilling across the wooden floors and warming the chill that had settled in during the night. He woke to the smell of damp wood and the faint creak of the old house stretching into life. His son still curled beneath a quilt in the small bedroom, his hair tousled and his breathing deep. For a long while he simply listened, feeling the silence that had once unnerved him now offer a kind of reassurance. The air carried the freshness of fields and soil, and though his body still felt the weight of exhaustion, his spirit was lighter. There was work to be done, work that could not be postponed. He stepped outside and surveyed the land. The farm stretched in every direction, fields wild with weeds, fences leaning and broken, barns weathered by years of neglect. It seemed an impossible undertaking, a lifetime of labor compressed into the shoulders of one man. Yet as he stood there, he felt something stir within him, a resolve he had not known in years. He was not alone this time. His son was with him, and though the boy's hands were small, his enthusiasm was vast enough to make the burden seem less heavy. The first days were consumed with the simplest of tasks. They swept out the rooms, gathered broken boards, and carried armfuls of debris to a growing pile by the fence line. Dust rose in clouds that clung to their clothes and hair, but with every sweep of the broom, the house grew brighter. Windows once darkened by boards opened to reveal skies so clear they seemed endless. In the evenings, they sat at the kitchen table, eating plain meals of bread and canned beans, their faces flushed from work, their spirits strangely satisfied. For the boy, every chore became an adventure. He ran to fetch water from the old pump, laughing when the handle squeaked and groaned, but still delivered clear, cold water. He followed his father into the fields, gathering stones as though they were treasures, stacking them carefully in little towers that toppled when the wind blew. He fed the chickens that had somehow survived years of abandonment, scattering grain with wide sweeps of his arms and chasing the birds when they darted away. Each task, no matter how small, filled him with joy, and his delight softened the man's weary determination into something gentler. The farm demanded more than tidying. Tools were rusted, machinery broken, and fences sagged dangerously. Repair became their constant companion, He spent hours bent over hinges, hammering nails into splintered wood, and coaxing the ancient stove back into life. His hands, long accustomed to city work that demanded little physical effort, grew calloused again, the skin cracking but toughening. At night he lay awake, muscles aching. But there was a satisfaction in the pain. It was the kind of exhaustion that came with creating, not merely surviving. When he first ventured into the nearby town, he felt the eyes of strangers upon him. They knew he was Edmund's son, though most had never met him. Some offered cautious greetings, their voices curious. Others kept their distance. He introduced himself, explained that he was trying to bring the farm back into use, and asked where he might sell a little produce. At first, they were wary, uncertain if he was merely passing through or if he meant to stay. But when he returned a few days later with eggs, a basket of vegetables pulled from the stubborn garden, and a willingness to trade, the conversation softened. A woman at the market smiled and handed him a few coins for his produce. Another asked if he might bring more next week. The beginnings of trust were laid in those small exchanges, and he carried the coins home like tokens of possibility. His son noticed the change even sooner. The boy delighted in watching neighbors stop by the stall and hearing them compliment the eggs and counting the few dollars they earned. To him, it was proof that the farm could give them what the city never had, something to be proud of, something that belonged to them. Each evening he asked what they would sell next, his mind spinning with ideas for gardens and animals. The father listened, sometimes amused, sometimes moved, recognizing in his son's excitement the kind of dream he himself had once carried before the city had worn it away. There were moments when despair threatened to creep back. A fence mended one day might collapse the next. Tools broke, rain fell for days, and the mud turned every chore into a battle. He would stand in the yard, water dripping from his hat, wondering if he had been foolish to come. But then his son would come racing through the puddles, boots splashing, cheeks flushed with laughter, and the man would remember why they had come. In those moments, he realized it was not only about reviving a farm, but about reviving themselves. The boy's fascination with the land grew daily. He spoke of the wide fields as though they were kingdoms, of the barn as though it were a fortress, of the animals as though they were companions in an unfolding adventure. One evening, after they had worked themselves to weariness and eaten their simple supper, the boy sat at the window and stared into the twilight. He turned to his father and said with quiet certainty that this life was better than the small apartment they had left behind. He did not miss the city streets, the cramped rooms, the endless noise. Here, he said, there was space to breathe. The man did not reply at first. His throat tightened, and he turned his gaze to the fields beyond the window. In the fading light, the land seemed vast and eternal, both a challenge and a promise. The boy's words settled into his heart like seeds, small but potent, and he knew they would grow. He began to see the farm not as a burden left behind by his father, but as an inheritance of possibility, a place where his son could thrive in ways the city would never allow. The days turned into weeks, and slowly, the rhythms of the farm replaced the rhythms of the city. Dawn brought chores instead of alarms, evenings brought quiet instead of screens and traffic. The house grew warmer, the fields began to show signs of life, and the boys' laughter became the soundtrack of their days. Each step forward was small, but together they formed a path. He began to think differently, not only about what the farm had been, but what it could become. The idea of selling it no longer seemed inevitable. The letter from his father had offered him freedom, but perhaps freedom did not mean escape. Perhaps it meant choosing to stay, to root himself where generations before him had stood, to give his son the gift of belonging. That night, as he stood once more on the porch, watching fireflies flicker in the grass, he realized something had shifted. The city felt distant, like a place he had once known but no longer belonged to. The farm, despite its broken fences and weary walls, was beginning to feel like home. And though he had not yet spoken the decision aloud, he knew that the path they were on was leading them deeper into this land, into a life not measured by what they had left behind, but by what they were building together. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm, the kind of rhythm his son quickly embraced, and that the man himself began to find both exhausting and strangely comforting. Each day began early with the first light over the hills, when the air still carried the chill of the night and the grass sparkled with dew. They worked on the land, fixed what was broken, learned to coax life out of soil that had gone untended for years. The boy thrived in this new world, his energy boundless, his curiosity leading him to every corner of the property. The father, though still weighed by doubts, felt the change as well. The city grew more distant with each sunrise, its noise and hurried pace fading into memory. Yet there remained one corner of the farm they had not touched, a looming structure that watched over them like a sentinel, the old hangar. It stood to the east of the farmhouse, its corrugated metal sides weathered by decades of wind and rain. Weeds and grass had grown tall around its foundation, almost as if the earth itself wanted to swallow it back. The doors were massive and rusted, closed so tightly that at first glance they seemed welded shut. Each time they passed it on the way to the fields or the barn, the boy's eyes lingered, filled with questions he did not voice at first. The father, for his part, avoided it. There was enough work with the house, the fences, the garden, and the livestock. The hangar felt like a problem for another time. But curiosity has a way of demanding attention, especially from children. On one late afternoon, after a long day of repairs and selling a few baskets of vegetables in town, the boy stood before the hangar doors and asked if they might see what was inside. His father hesitated. He imagined piles of broken machinery, rotted wood, or perhaps nothing but emptiness. He feared that whatever lay within would be a reminder of neglect, a shadow of what had been lost. Yet his son's eyes carried such anticipation that refusal seemed cruel. So together, they approached the doors, their steps cautious, the gravel crunching beneath their boots. The handles were stiff, rusted nearly solid. He pushed with all his strength, and for a moment it seemed the doors would not yield. Then, with a groan, like some ancient creature waking from sleep, the metal shifted, the hinges protesting as the gap widened enough to let in a blade of light. Dust swirled in the air, disturbed for the first time in years. With a final heave, the doors opened wide, and the interior of the hangar was revealed. The sight took him by surprise. He had expected ruin, but what greeted them was something altogether different. The space was vast, the ceiling high, wooden beams arching above like the ribs of a cathedral. Dust lay thick on every surface, but beneath it, order prevailed. Boxes were stacked carefully along the walls, each one labeled in a hand he recognized from the letter his father had left. Shelves lined one side, filled with jars, old tins, and bundles wrapped in cloth. Against the far wall sat a workbench, its surface covered with tools, as though someone had just stepped away from a task and never returned. The boy rushed forward, his excitement filling the cavernous space. He pulled at the lids of boxes, sneezed when dust rose in clouds, and laughed at the discoveries. Inside the first few boxes were toys, small wooden cars, a stuffed bear with one ear bent, puzzles with faded colors. The man's breath caught as recognition struck. These were his toys. Objects he had believed long gone, lost to time, now sat here, preserved as though waiting for him. He opened another box and found photographs, carefully arranged in albums, images of himself as a child running across these very fields, held in the arms of a younger version of his father. His hands trembled as he turned the pages, each image pulling memories from the depths of his mind. Moments of laughter, the smell of freshly cut hay, the sound of his father's voice before silence grew between them. In another corner, stacked neatly, were his old school notebooks, his drawings, even the report cards he had once tried to hide. His father had kept them all, treasured them in this secret vault of memory. The realization hit with a force that nearly brought him to his knees. For years he had believed his departure had been a kind of severing, that his father had let him go without regret. But here was evidence to the contrary. His father had preserved every fragment of his childhood, had honored his growth even in absence. The boy's laughter echoed through the hangar as he pulled out toy after toy, marveling at how different they were from the plastic gadgets of the city. He held up a wooden horse, chipped and worn, and asked if his father had played with it. The man nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He watched his son play with relics of his own past, and in that moment, time folded in on itself. 3 generations seemed to stand together in the hangar: the grandfather who had kept these things, the father who had forgotten them, and the boy who now rediscovered them. The hours slipped by as they explored. Each box revealed more letters written by neighbors, tools once used in the fields, clothing folded and preserved. But it was the toys and photographs that lingered in their hearts. The hangar was not a storehouse of junk, but a testament of love, a silent message from the father who had never stopped caring, even if he had never spoken it aloud. As dusk settled outside, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, they finally stepped back, the hangar doors left open to breathe for the first time in decades. The man felt both heavy and light-heavy with regret for years wasted, light with the knowledge that his father's silence had not been abandonment, but something else entirely, something more complex and tender. That night, as they sat at the kitchen table, the boy chattered about his discoveries, his eyes bright with excitement. He spoke of the toys as treasures, of the photographs as proof that this place had always been meant for them. The father listened, nodding, his thoughts drifting to the boxes of memories now uncovered. For the first time, he felt not only the weight of inheritance, but the warmth of belonging. The farm was no longer a question of survival or obligation. It was becoming a home, bound together by past and present, by what had been preserved and what was yet to be built. Lying awake later, he thought of the hangar, of the dust and the silence, of the way his son's laughter had filled the space. He realized that the choice his father had left him was never simply about selling or staying. It was about recognizing the ties that had never been broken, even across years of absence. The hangar had revealed more than objects. It had revealed the truth of love held quietly, patiently, without demand. And so, without speaking it aloud, he knew their course was set. The farm would not be sold. It would not be abandoned. It would be lived in, worked, and cherished. It would become the foundation of their lives, not as a relic of the past, but as a promise to the future. As he drifted into sleep, the sounds of the night around him, he felt for the first time that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The discovery in the hangar lingered in their minds for days, not as a single event, but as a presence that seemed to change the air they breathed. It was no longer simply a storage place of old tools and rusting metal, but a living testament that had bound 3 lives together across time. The boy carried the toys he had found into the house, placing them on shelves and windowsills as if decorating a shrine. The man moved the boxes of photographs to the main room, where each evening he would open one and sift through the past, his fingers tracing the edges of images that showed a boy running across fields, laughing beside a man who had aged into silence but had never ceased to remember. The house itself seemed to shift in atmosphere. Where before there had been the weight of absence, now there was memory, continuity, and a sense of belonging that grew with every hour they spent there. The farm's daily rhythm resumed, but it was no longer a rhythm of trial and uncertainty. Instead, it carried the assurance of purpose. The man rose each morning before dawn, stepping into the crisp air to mend fences, to prepare the soil, to gather eggs, to see that their animals had what little care they required. His body grew strong in ways that city life had never demanded, his muscles aching each night, not with frustration, but with accomplishment. The boy shadowed him everywhere, eager to learn, to help, to run through the dew-soaked grass as though it were a kingdom newly inherited. His small hands grew calloused from tools, his face browned by the sun, but his eyes were alight with joy. Each task became a discovery, each discovery a triumph. The man began to notice how the boy spoke of the city less and less. At first, the child had asked about friends, about familiar streets, about the apartment that had once been their whole world. But those questions faded as the weeks turned into months. Now he spoke of the fields, the orchard, the stream that cut across the far end of the property where he liked to skip stones. He spoke of the neighbors who had started to greet them more warmly, of the satisfaction he felt when they sold their produce in the town market, of the endless stars that filled the night sky above the valley. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the horizon fade to dusk, the boy declared that this place was better than the city because it was bigger than walls, bigger than noise, bigger than the limits of a crowded street. It was a declaration spoken without hesitation, a truth revealed from the pure heart of a child. The father carried those words into his own heart, turning them over again and again in the quiet of the night. He had come with doubt, with plans to sell, to return to the city and its demands, to use the farm only as a means to an end. But the land had claimed him in ways he had not expected. The soil under his nails, the sky above his head, the laughter of his son in wide open fields, all of it reminded him of what it meant to live rather than simply exist. The hangar had given him proof that his father had never let go, and now his son gave him proof that the future belonged here, not elsewhere. Work on the farm grew not only steadier, but more ambitious. Together, they cleared the orchard, pruning trees until they began to show signs of bearing fruit once more. They repaired the barn so that animals could be sheltered again, and with the help of neighbors, they acquired a few goats and chickens to add to the flock. In town, their produce began to draw regular customers, and slowly they earned a modest but steady income. Each small success felt monumental, a step forward on ground that once seemed uncertain. The boy carried baskets of apples with pride, speaking to customers with a confidence that surprised his father. He had grown into the land, his spirit stretching as far as the fields themselves. The memory of the hangar drew them back often. Sometimes they opened boxes simply to sit with the past, sometimes to show a new photograph or object to each other, and sometimes only to feel the connection that bound them to the man who had preserved all those things. It was in those quiet visits that the father came to understand what the real inheritance was. It was not the land alone, nor the objects, nor even the farm as a whole. It was the continuity of love expressed in silence, the thread of care that tied generations together, no matter the years or the distance. As the seasons began to turn, the man realized he no longer thought of leaving. The city, once the center of his life, now seemed a memory blurred by distance. He remembered its crowded streets, its endless noise, its struggle for survival, but it no longer called to him. What called to him now was the sound of wind moving through the fields, the sight of his son running freely with the dog they had taken in, the quiet satisfaction of a day's work completed with his own hands. He understood now what his father's letter had meant. The choice was never about money or convenience. It was about seeing what truly mattered and deciding to embrace it. One evening, they stood again before the hangar, watching the sun set in colors that turned the metal walls to gold. The boy asked if they would ever leave, if one day they would return to the city. The father looked at his son, at the farm, at the horizon that stretched farther than he could ever walk, and he knew the answer. They would stay. This was no longer a place of uncertainty, but a place of belonging. It was where his father had lived and remembered him, where his own child now thrived, where the line of their family found root and meaning. The decision was not spoken with ceremony, but lived with conviction. Each nail driven into a repaired fence, each seed planted in the soil, each evening spent watching the stars, all of it became part of the vow to remain. The farm would not be sold or abandoned. It would be lived in, cherished, and passed forward, not as a burden, but as a gift. The boy's laughter in the fields was proof enough that the decision was right. The father's heart, lighter than it had been in years, carried the peace of knowing that he had chosen well. As autumn drew near, they gathered the first real harvest together, the baskets filled with apples, the shelves stocked with jars of preserves, the smell of wood smoke curling from the chimney. All spoke of permanence. The boy no longer asked about the city. He spoke instead of next year's harvest, of animals they might raise, of dreams that grew as naturally as the crops in their fields. The father listened, knowing that those dreams were stronger, truer, and freer than anything he had once chased in the city. The hangar stood open often now, its once silent space filled with echoes of voices, laughter, and the sound of footsteps. It no longer felt like a monument to what was lost, but a living room of memory and continuity. And as the father watched his son running across the fields with a wooden toy horse in hand, he understood that the real legacy of his own father was not simply the land or the preserved belongings. It was the courage to stay, to rebuild, to love in silence, but with depth, and to hand that love forward into the future. In the stillness of the valley at night, when the house glowed with lamplight and the fields whispered with the wind, he finally felt at peace. They had come searching for direction, carrying the weight of grief and uncertainty, but they had found a home. The decision had been made not in words, but in living, and it would carry them forward as surely as the seasons would turn. The farm was no longer just an inheritance. It was life. It was future. It was theirs. If this story touched you, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Take a moment to watch our other videos for more powerful stories still to come. And don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.